AA Beyond Belief is a podcast by, for, and about people who have found a secular path to sobriety in Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, we're here for another podcast, AA Beyond Belief. This is John, and I have a guest today. His name is Chad H., and he is from Chandler, Arizona, or at least he lives there now. And he sent me a message on Facebook and told me a little bit about his story, and it sounded real similar to mine. So I thought, well, it's been a while since we've had someone share their personal story. So I thought, come on the podcast and let's talk about it. How you doing, Chad?
I'm doing well. Well, good that you have me on here today. Looking forward to this.
And this is like my favorite thing in the world to do. If I could do this for a living, I would. Just to kick back, have a cup of coffee, talk to somebody in AA, somebody who pretty much agrees with me.
Yeah. No, I mean that's always a bonus, right?
Yeah. Well, occasionally I'll have someone who doesn't agree, or I don't agree with, but I don't make a big thing out of it. It's that. Have you ever heard any of the episodes I've had with John H. from DC?
So is that the one? So I was listening to one recently. I can't remember his name. Was that the one you guys were talking about deprogramming?
Yeah. That was actually an interesting conversation. Now I don't agree with him on. I don't agree with him on everything, but it's cool. That's cool. He's a nice guy. I like having him on. He's a very interesting guest. So let's get right into it if you don't mind. Let's you just go into your story and let a conversation flow from that. The floor is yours.
That sounds good. So I mean, really, for me, like a lot of people, I guess you could start with my sort of family history. It's all over my family. I had a, grandfather die from it in his 40s. Cousins, both my parents are alcoholics. And so, for me personally, I believe that it's a genetic thing in my brain, and I got it, But grew up in a fairly normal home. I mean, the one thing about both of my parents being alcoholics is that they were sober and they were going to meetings. So I knew about AA pretty young. I'd go to the meetings once in a while with them. And when I was a young kid, I didn't really understand it. I just knew that we'd go to these smoke-filled rooms and eat sugar cubes in the back of the room, but I didn't really know what it was. But, as far as growing up in the household, I mean, no, nothing crazy. I mean, we always had what we needed. We were kind of a lower middle income family, but everything was good. Felt loved, nothing crazy. One thing, I was always kind of a nervous, kind of a worrier type kid, high anxiety, I guess you could say, coupled along the line too with perfectionist. I was always kind of one of those kids that, if I wasn't the best or the first right away, I would be like, screw it. I don't want nothing to do with it. But again, nothing crazy in the household. But, when I was 17 years old, which can be, I guess that's kind of late for some people, but I got drunk for the first time. Up to that point, I hadn't really had any opportunities to drink alcohol or be around it. And I remember it like it was yesterday because it had such a profound effect on me. When I was new in AA, there used to be a gentleman that I kind of stole it from, but he always used to talk about, the first time that he had, he loved pepperoni pizza, but he couldn't remember the first time he ever had it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
He loved chocolate ice cream, all these types of things. But I can tell you that almost, yeah, it's crazy, right? Because it just had such a profound effect, you know? So I remember I was at a lake cabin with a couple of guys in Minnesota, and we were drinking Busch Light Pounders, the big, tall 16-ounce cans, and whiskey. And I remember when I got enough in me to achieve that effect, I remember thinking to myself, wow, I like this. This is good, and I proceeded to develop that phenomenon of craving right off the bat. I'd never drank before. And it was like that first time I couldn't get drunk enough. I mean, I was doing shots of tequila. I mean, instantly the physical part just took over right off the bat. I blacked out, had probably the worst hangover I ever had, but I loved that effect. I'm more of a binge drinker. I did that for the next 5 years. I'm not a guy that could drink every day. I was always like, get really hammered, off and running, maybe sober for a couple of days, back on it. But once I flipped that switch, I was gone, and I never meant to do it. It was never like, I'm going to go out and get drunk. It was like, let's go have a couple beers. And it was like that certain point, So I did that from age 17 to 22. Now, I mentioned before that I was around AA, so I knew a little bit about it. And I don't really know what happened. Like, I'm one of those people that, I didn't have any real external consequences. I didn't get in trouble. I never went to, I drove drunk a lot. I got lucky. I was in a smaller town, like 50,000 people. So, it wasn't like I was getting on freeways going 70 miles an hour. So, but I would say the last couple of times, maybe the last few months I was drinking, I knew there was something off. I just knew it. I'm like, I didn't drink like other people. And I think that's probably why alcoholics tend to drink with other alcoholics, is who the heck wants to be around some guy that's, going home at 9 after 3. I didn't relate to guys like that. But maybe the second to last time I drank, I had promised myself I was going to try not to drive anymore. And I ended up driving in a blackout. And it was just kind of a combination of that. And I just thought, you know what? I need to take a look at this. There's a problem here. And I think it also helped that I was around some AA members. My dad was an AA member. I would go, he had a little store in my hometown, and I'd go by and see him, and there'd be these guys and they're hanging out, and I knew they weren't drinkers, and they were kind of smiling, and they had this little gleam, and they go, oh, how you doing, Chad? And, that kind of that thing, when you're still drinking, you're like, that guy, but I respected it. And I don't know. I just said, you know what? I probably need to go. There was this Tuesday night meeting that I knew about. I'm like, I probably should go to that meeting. I'm like, I'm drinking way too much. And I don't have an answer to why that is. Surrender is a funny thing. Something clicked for me. I can't explain it. And like, from the moment I made that decision that I needed to be at that meeting, it was removed from me. Like, I didn't really think about it after that, and I don't know if that was a combination of that. I was still pretty young and I hadn't drank like for 20 years, but it wasn't that big a deal for me. I went in, I need to be here. I accepted it. That particular meeting, I've come to find out now, was pretty unique. And, I've been to a lot of meetings since. They kept it very simple. The format, and it's still the same today. The format was what we used to be like, what happened, what we like now. There wasn't a topic. They would just call on members of the group that would come up and share. And their whole idea was that it was more about, they would do that so that the new guy would come in and hopefully, relate. And then they could say, man, I'm struggling too. What did you guys do? And hopefully bring them along the path. It wasn't about necessarily that the new person needed to share and get stuff off their chest. It was, hey, they're struggling. Here's what we do. So they basically just said, get a home group that meets at the same time and place, be at that meeting every week, get a sponsor and use that sponsor, and don't drink. And as far as the sponsorship thing, I mean, they weren't like this diehard, you better call your sponsor every 5 minutes. I mean, there'd be jokes once in a while, did you ask your sponsor about that? But it wasn't like a real just hardcore. And then as far as like God and stuff, I mean, people would talk about God and mention God and prayer and stuff. But up at that point, I never really had a big thing about God. I wasn't anti-God, but I was just kind of like, I kind of instinctively, I guess my thought on God, if there was a God, was he didn't know the difference between me and a tree. It's just kind of this thing, right? And it's just kind of there. And so I never was like, well, he's judging me, blah, blah, blah. So I went to this meeting for 6 years, I apologize. And I was there every week, and I never heard about 90 and 90 and some of these other things. Like, I didn't even know what they were. I just knew that, okay, I made a decision. I probably shouldn't drink anymore. And I just accepted it. And I was there and I sponsored guys. I went through the steps, and those were good tools, I guess. There was nothing I wasn't against any of that type of stuff. I guess fast forward a little bit, about 5-6 years in, my wife and I decided that, just from a career standpoint and our future standpoint, her sister was down here in Phoenix, and we thought, maybe it'd be good to move it on down, better opportunities down. So we packed it on up and rolled down here to Phoenix. So I came down here with a head full AA and thought, okay, I'm going to find a group and I'm going to get going. And things were good. They're okay for a little while. But for the next 7 years, like, I never got comfortable in a meeting. It's kind of like, I heard somebody in AA say one time that alcoholics are a lot like baby ducks, right? Like, have you ever heard that before? Like the first meeting, like the first meetings you go to, it's like a baby duck. The first thing it sees, it thinks it's its mom, right? The first meetings you go to, right, those are the ones you sort of gravitate towards. Yeah. And so for me, I never got real comfortable. I came down to Phoenix and it was just different, more topic type, just the way they did things. And I was okay with some of that. I would go to a home group for a while. I joined it. I was there, and then I'd leave again. And I jumped around to probably 3 or 4 different home groups. But I was always at meetings. I was always there. but I'd say somewhere along my 6th year or so, I really started to develop a different way of looking at God, or it's probably starting to lean more towards atheist type views. Because I would sit in a meeting and I would hear a guy say like, God gave me this job today because I prayed, or just some of the wording. And I get it, like everybody's different. But I had a sponsor that was really into God, and he would tell me I should be praying every day. I should be doing these types of things. And I don't know what happened. It just really was bothering me. And I was getting very uncomfortable with that type of thinking in AA. And my 13th year, the last couple of months of that year would have been 2011. I probably went about a month without going to a meeting, and I hadn't done that in 13 years. And I wasn't feeling the meetings anymore. And my sponsor called me up, said, "What's the deal? Aren't you going to AA anymore?" I'm like, well, maybe AA isn't for every alcoholic. Maybe there's something else. Maybe I know I can't drink, but maybe if I do some other things. He's like, well, that's not going to work, whatever. And I picked up my 13-year medallion at a meeting, and I was just real honest. I said, I don't really want to be here. I hope that changes. I think I went to one more meeting, and then I picked up March of 2012. Now, I'm not here to blame AA or meetings or say that's the reason I drank. I think it was also, I got this thought in my head that I'm just a high-strung person, and maybe if I could just relax once in a while, And I came into AA at 22, and I was pretty young. Maybe I wasn't even an alcoholic. Maybe I was just a binge drinker or whatever. And I picked up, and I went 5 more years of drinking. And in the beginning, hey, it wasn't. I mean, I was drinking. I still was going to work. I was still, all my external things seemed okay. I maintained my job. And so I'd go have some beers with the guys once in a while. I felt kind of like back in the saddle, but that one thing, and that for me, the most important thing of this is abstinence for me now, because that physical part for me was just, once I start drinking, for me, it's probably about the 3 or 4 drink mark, somewhere in there. I can't go. And most of the time I black out, most of the time, because I just go so hard and fast, and so I did that for 5 years. And every now and then, I'd have a bad night, and I think I'd go to a meeting, like maybe 3 or 4 years in. I think I went to a few meetings, and then I was like, and then I'd go back. The last time I drank, I actually had drank. My kids were actually out of town. It was just me and my wife. And I had drank like 3 or 4 days in a row, pretty heavily, like binge drinking. I had never done that up to that point. And I ended up having some physical withdrawals, and I got really sick. And I mean, just like shaky. I went into the urgent care, and the doctor diagnosed me. He called it holiday heart. He said sometimes when people over the holidays, they're drinking too much, when they come out of it. So, but I think that this time around, having 13 years of AA in my head, along with the drinking, I just said to myself, like, it was just open wide enough for me to surrender again and say, this just can't. I gotta look at this again. So I ended up calling that sponsor back up. He met me at a meeting, and I started going to meetings again. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I had some of the highest anxiety I'd ever had in my life. I mean, I look at it now, and I'm kind of a science buff, and I do a lot of reading about this type of thing. And I think my chemicals in my brain were trying to reset themselves. They're used to this thing in their system every couple of days, and it wasn't there anymore. And I would go to meetings, but I'd probably say 6 months in, I'm like, I'm having such a hard time with this God thing, and I can't sit in these meetings, and even like with the steps, I'm like, I was having a really hard time with it. So I don't know what happened, but I went on my computer one day, and I just typed in like atheist AA. I don't remember exactly how I did it. And this thing popped up, secular meetings. I'm like, what's this? I'd never heard of that. And so this is probably going on a little over 2 years ago. This was, so I got sober July 2017, this last time around. But I'm like, I wonder what these are. So so I found one that was in the Tempe, Arizona, real close to me. And I ended up going over there, and I walked in, and the format was, hey, there was nothing in there about God. There was no prayer. There was anything. It was just pretty much a regular AA meeting. It was just cool to know that there were other people that were struggling with this, and that there is a way to get sober without God or even like the steps. Sometimes I'm not, I mean, to me, the steps are very simple. They mean what they say, and I think they're good tools, but this thing this driven into you. Here's what you need to do, all the time. And so I went to these secular meetings, and the ones that I went to, I would have to say were pretty much just like a traditional AA meeting, but removing the God stuff. I found them the jargon was the same. Some
Right,
of those
right.
things were the
Yeah,
same, and
yeah.
which was fine. I mean, what had always drawn to me to AA in the first place from the beginning when I first came in 1998 was one of the old timers there. You always used to say when you'd go and hear another alcoholic share, it was kind of like a bedtime story, right? It just kind of comforted you, because to me, in my opinion, what Bill and Bob found more than anything was that ability to relate to one another, to sit down with another alcoholic and be honest. Here's what's going on in my life, And I know obviously all the other stuff, steps, God, and all those things came out of that stuff. But to me, just that act of like what you and I are just talking right now, just relating, and for me to, when I remember those first few meetings, just listening to someone. So I liked that. But one thing I did have to get over, and this is something I see sometimes in this agnostic, secular movement, and I try not to be this way, is this sort of, and even playing down traditional meetings, kind of be negative about them, or why, whatever. I don't want to be that way anymore. Like, I have no problem going into a regular traditional meeting now and just sitting and listening and sharing. I do sometimes mention I'm an atheist and the only reason I do that is because I feel like, in 2011, if somebody had said that in a meeting when I was struggling with that, I might have stuck around. I don't know. I maybe wouldn't have. I can't say that for sure, but I don't, when I do share in a meeting and I do mention that, I don't go off on tangents and try to prove anything or, get into it with anybody. It's just, this is me. Right. I don't get so caught up anymore in the wording. If somebody says God or whatever, and I'm sure you've heard this before, and it is, the good orderly direction thing, or sometimes I just say, we're using words to describe things in different ways.
That's right.
Somebody says God,
Same experience,
I say,
but you're describing it differently.
Exactly. And I'm looking at it as like, my whole thing is like, my higher power or whatever, the way I live is I try to be a part of the ever-changing flow of the universe. That's it. And the universe is going to do what it's going to do, and I'm just trying to be a part of it.
When you were describing that group as using the jargon and so forth, in my mind, it clicked with me. Okay, those people were going to traditional AA probably for a long time and then started going to the secular group, because see, my group here in KC, the majority of the people have never been to traditional AA. So you don't hear that. You don't have that tradition of that jargon. And you also don't have people who can compare their secular experience to the traditional experience. Now, there are some like me who have had that background, but the majority haven't. And what's so cool about that is with the majority of people not having that background, that subject just never comes up. It's just kind of, I like that. Yeah. So that tells me that, because every group is a little bit different, and groups go through changes too. Like when we first started our group, we were AA people. We had that experience, and there was some AA bashing going on, especially during our growing process when we had people from another group discovered us. And I mean, I swear to God, like for 3 months, almost every meeting was bashing the group they came from.
Right. Yeah.
So
no, I get that.
But it changed over time to where that's not happening. And, so that's kind of cool. But yeah, that when you said that, the jargon, it told me what type that the group, and I know some of the people from Arizona, so that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some good, and I've definitely met some people here, and it's been good. But the thing is it's like kind of like, actually your point about that actually brings me back a little bit to my very first meeting, because my first meeting I went to, like I said, I'd never heard some of those things of like 90 and 90 and some, I never even, when I first moved to Phoenix, I heard that for the first time. I'm like, what is that? I don't even know what 90 is.
And where did you come from Phoenix?
North Dakota.
Okay.
North Dakota. Yeah. So there was a meeting, in Moorhead, Minnesota. It was called the Thursday Night Moorhead. There was a gentleman there. He's long since passed. His name was Don Nicholson. And to me, we always have those one or two guys that stand out to us, and he was one of those guys that he put things very simply. He had a number of years sober. In fact, I guess he had knew Bill Wilson a little bit. And so he was just one of those guys. And so that meeting, so my hometown was an offshoot of that group. And their whole idea was just keep things simple. And it's about the newcomer. It's not about, like, we didn't even give out medallions. Like when I was there, we'd recognize sobriety, but we would always say that the reason we're recognizing sobriety is so that new person can see that it's a way to do it. We didn't make it about us. So, and I'm not against any of that stuff, but again, it's back to kind of what you're saying with the secular meetings, that you bring in these new people now. They don't know about that other stuff. They don't know about, whatever, meeting makers make it, or all those slogans,
you don't hear any of that.
all that type of stuff. So yeah, I mean, and my main goal, like when I reached out to you, was my goal today now is I just trying to be helpful. I just want to, if somebody can relate to, what I've gone through. I mean, I got to tell you one thing, with somebody who, had 13 years of pretty active, good AA. I mean, I could quote that big book verbatim. I know, to go back out and drink for 5 years and now have that experience. I tell people all the time, like my dad and I talk pretty regularly. He's still an active member of AA, and he's over 40 some years sober. And I tell him all the time that now that I hopefully come out of that, and I don't want to go back to that, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Like I had to go through that because it changed a lot of perception. Like for me, it's all about changing my perception. One of my AA, I guess, heroes, for lack of a better word, was Chuck Chamberlain, Chuck C, and New Pair of Glasses guy. And he talked a lot about God and stuff, but he always talked about it's uncovering, discovering, and discarding. Discovering, get rid of those old ideas. And that's what I try to do today, is to be open and remain teachable. And that would be my only thing, like with meetings today. When I do go to meetings, I think I try to look at it as a perspective from a newcomer. And I think sometimes traditional AA meetings, in my opinion, they get so caught up in doing things a certain way that I think they forget, guys get 20 years sober, 30 years sober. This is how we've always done it. There's an old story one time that I heard. One of my old managers in business told me. He said there was a mom on Easter Sunday, and she was cooking a ham. And before she put the ham in the oven, she cut the ends of the ham off. And her daughter asked her, "Mom, why are you doing that?" She's like, "I don't even know why. Why don't you go ask Grandma? She always did that. She's in the living room." Go out, ask your grandma, "Grandma, why did you cut the ends of the ham off?" Grandma said, "My mom always used to do that." Well, it turned out, you could probably guess, that once upon a time, the stoves were a lot smaller. So they had to cut the ends of the ham off to get them in the stove. Yeah. And so I look at meetings sometimes, and, some of the things we do in meetings, I think, why are we still doing this? Like, one of the big things that I have a hard time with when I would go to the meetings here, and they're not all that way. I'm not here to meeting bash or anything, but if I'm somebody who's struggling with drinking, I'm having a hard time. I'm like, I have a job. I seem to be able to function, whatever, but God, when I drink, I can't seem to stop. Let me go check out this AA thing. Let me go. Well, it's at this church. Okay. Well, it's a right away church. Okay. All right. I'll pull in the parking lot. Meeting starts at 8. I don't want to go in too early. All right. I'll come in. Maybe I'll come in at 8:01. I'll sit down in the back and I'll start listening. And then what's the meetings here? I don't know how about where you're from, but one of the first thing, anybody new here tonight? And I just feel like it took everything in that power for that guy to get in that door, And our whole thing was that my first home group was, if I'm at that meeting every single week, if I see a new face come in, whether or not that person has 3 days or 3 years, I should go over and introduce myself. And if they're new, I'm going to find out in a second. I don't have to reach, something small like that. But that's kind of my thing when I start to have some issues with AA. It's just
well,
some of those.
Speaking of that, we made a change in our group, and this part of the Midwest. What's traditional for AA groups to do when they have a newcomer at the meeting, they give them what's called a first step meeting. So basically, so you go around the room and everybody tells their stories. And usually those are very long meetings because people don't know how to. So, but it puts that new guy on the spot, because all the attention is on that new person, and they're already uncomfortable, so our group decided, we're going to dispense with that. And we have, and it's worked out really well. We just decided instead that we just want to make people feel comfortable there. That's all.
Well, it's hard enough just to get them there.
Yeah.
And
once they're there, make them feel comfortable, give them a cup of coffee, say hello, make them part of the group.
Well, and I think that, and I don't know if this comes out of treatment or whatever, but this idea that you go to a meeting to share and get things off your chest, and that's what makes you feel better. like, in my opinion, that's not what it is at all. I mean, that's maybe good at some point if you have a sponsor or whatever, or a good friend to get some things off your chest. But the meeting itself, in my opinion, is to go there, relate, and then if you decide, hey, what you guys are talking about, I want to try to do too. How did you guys do it? And surrender is a funny thing. I mean, it's not just something you just, hey, there's no surrender gauge. I heard a speaker say one time, there's nothing at the door that when you walk in that says, okay, I'm this much surrendered. It's time. It takes, there's no way of like knowing what it's going to take for someone to surrender. Everybody's different, and back to your point about making somebody feel comfortable. If you can just get that guy coming to the meeting every week, maybe he doesn't share, maybe he just comes and listens, or the gal or whoever. And pretty soon one day after the meeting, they might come up to you and go, yeah, I really like what you had to say there. And, what did you guys do there? Like, and it's just kind of can work out that way. I think sometimes.
Yeah, I think so too. Just let things just kind of happen naturally over time. People they feel comfortable in the group. They make friends. That's what I see happening. They make friends, and they might get a sponsor. They might work steps, and all without having pressure being put on them to get a sponsor, or pressure being put on them to get the steps. You also mentioned something about language, and I learned that after I discovered the whole agnostic AA meetings. I never really stopped to think about the language that we use, because I'm like you. I came in young. I was going to AA meetings for 25 years. I went to the same group, and it was a group that was really entrenched in the big book. And they weren't bad guys or anything at all, but they were very much doing things the way that they've always been done. And I was just, that was just all I knew. That's the only language I knew, was the language of the big book. So when I realized I was an atheist and I was trying to figure out what to do about AA, I went online and I connected with other people who were non-believers. And that's when I learned that, it is language. It's just that, I have a different way of describing my experience, but we basically are going through the same thing. And I'm okay. And I am totally okay with that. But early on, it seemed to me that, well, for sure, my home group wasn't accepting of my new outlook. And I didn't feel comfortable at other groups, but that was probably only because I had that long experience being one way and then abruptly changing. And that was a hard break for me. It was really hard to assimilate, I guess, or to somehow balance that with the old group. So I don't really go to traditional meetings or regular meetings anymore. Although during this pandemic, I've been to a couple, which I really enjoyed. I went to a St. Louis speaker meeting that was a bunch of people in St. Louis. I really liked that. And I went to a meeting of, it was called Oldie Pa, which is really interesting. They were former young people in AA who are now old.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That
Oldie Pa.
Oldie Pa. I like
that. That was kind of cool. So there's a bunch of people like me, basically. They came in their 20s and now they're in their 50s, or, it's like, oh, how? Yeah.
Well, and see, and it's interesting you bring that up, because that to me, like, I've gone to a few younger people meetings that I went to before. And, there's this whole group of guys that are like, I'm in my 40s, right? And when the guys came around, there's a whole group of guys that I know that are in their 40s and they've been sober 20 some years, whatever. And I think sometimes, they forget, like when I was out there drinking for 5 years with this head full of AA, and I was very guilty of doing this. Sometimes, I'm 10, 11, 12 years sober, I'm in my 30s. You get kind of arrogant sometimes, you think to yourself, a guy comes in and he's struggling and he's, a couple days sober, and I'd kind of be like, wow, just go to meetings, what are you doing? Whatever, and it's just like, it completely changed my viewpoint of that after drinking for 5 years. Now I see somebody coming in and they're struggling. I'm a little more like, no, I understand that, and so it's a funny dynamic that, with the younger people, like I said, coming in younger and having that. And then there's another group above that, like, that of guys that I know. And this had me thinking about what you were talking about with your home group, is when you started to have those other viewpoints, that's threatening to them, because when you believe a certain way and all of a sudden, hey, I've based my whole life on this way of thinking, and now you're saying no, 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 that's threatening, and that can be,
and it had to frustrate some of them too, who knew me for decades, being one John. And then all of a sudden this new character comes by talking about, oh, I don't need God. Actually, really, I don't.
and I don't know, I'm going to guess your experience was similar to mine. Once you've sort of accepted that belief and that way of life, it was a freeing thing.
Yes, I was very happy.
I felt like I was being me,
Yep. Yep.
I felt very fake sometimes when I'd be sitting in meetings those last couple of years and be like, God, I just don't think this way. I don't believe in this, but I better, because, otherwise who knows,
Right.
There's something freeing about that.
No, I remember when I first started having those thoughts, and I was reading books like God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins' book, Oh Well, all those books. And, I was afraid to let anybody know I was reading those books. I wouldn't tell anybody. Oh, what are you reading? Oh,
yeah.
Well,
No. And people in my life, I've mentioned that I think that way. And it's always funny, like the ones, it is interesting to me who reacts and who doesn't, and you find out real quick where you stand with some people. And now I'm the kind of person today too, though, where I don't just go out and when I immediately meet someone, lay out everybody thinking my beliefs right in front of them. I kind of feel them out. You kind of see where people are, and there's just still, and it's getting better, I think, but there's this attitude towards, atheism, or for sure, those beliefs. And I hope it keeps continuing to go. It seems like it is,
People
again,
can be shocked too. People can be shocked. Like, and I experienced some of this shock. Like, okay, the first time I heard somebody in AA dismiss the steps openly, what the hell?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I get it now. I mean, I do like the steps. They're important to me. They're part of who I am and how I operate. But I'm not so rigid about them. And I understand them mostly as an expression of an experience for like definitely the first three are just an experience, it's not necessarily something that I could manufacture. And then the inventory, of course, is something I do, and making amends is something that I do. But and then there's an experience that comes from that. But so much of the rest of it is just from the experience that I had.
Yeah,
that's it.
Well, and I was really, I look at it now, and I think I was really fortunate to be around this one particular gentleman that I mentioned, this Don, early on, because he used to talk about the steps kind of like what you said. They're very simple. They're not. You used to hear, I hear people talk about, oh God, I've been on this step for like a week. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? Like, when you can't, step one, in my opinion, you can't just sit down if you're going to do it. You can't. It's like you said, it's an experience.
Right. You either did it or not. You have it or had it or not. Yeah,
exactly. This last time through, I took step one in my shower. I got to a point where I'm like,
right.
I knew I couldn't drink, and I knew I couldn't not drink, and it freaked me out,
right.
And so, yeah, so I think they're very simple. I think they're good tools as well. I mean, I'm not anti-step at all. I did.
Now you can apply those to different things. Like you can take that
Exactly.
first step. You can use what you learned from the experience and apply it to other problems in your life. Like for example, I'm having a problem at work. First step, admit that I have a problem at work. Come to think that there's something I can do about the problem and make a decision to do that. And then, I mean, the whole process is stuff. So it's like, it's not that just because step one isn't something that I could actually quote work or do, doesn't mean that I couldn't learn from it.
Right. Well, and I think when it comes to the steps, and again, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well, I look at it as just another tool that I could use to help me along this journey. I think the initial surrender, you come, and once you fully admit to yourself, okay, abstinence is the only way I can do this. I can't, there's no in between. And then fully concede to my innermost self that I am powerless. I can't drink anymore. I can't do it. And what I feel, for me, what you decide to do from there is your deal. I tend to lean more towards some AA stuff because I like hearing that. I like hearing people talk about it. I like the people because I relate to them more. But again, when I don't ever want to, and this is where sometimes I think like you get into this AA exclusivity. I don't know a better way to say it. Like we're like this separate entity, like, the normies or whatever. I don't like stuff like that. I'm not, I'm just a person, just like anybody else. I'm not, I happen to have this thing in my brain that when I drink alcohol, I can't seem to stop. But other than that, I want to be like everybody else. I don't want to be this separate society. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
I know. I was talking to Angela about that on one of our Friday streams. That when I was first getting involved, when I was first getting sober, the term that was used was Earth people. So in other words, the Earth people were the non-alcoholics. And it was always, the person would always talk about it like in some kind of a comical way, how strangely unique we are from the rest of the society. Like we're like from outer space or something. And these Earth people that are walking around, they just can't possibly understand us because we
no,
are
not at
so
all.
different.
Yeah, they don't get sad or depressed or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
They don't have anxiety or, and that was like, and I don't, when I get into my story sometimes too, when I talk, I don't usually get too crazy on like what I was like before I drank. I know that's kind of the thing, guys are like, oh, that's what I was like before I drank or whatever. And yeah, I will say, yeah, that definitely we share a lot of the same characteristics, anxiety, depression, but there's plenty of people out there that have anxiety and depression that are just as bad as us, but except the one difference is when they take a drink, it doesn't do anything for them. So I try to, I don't get too crazy on that type of stuff. I guess I sort of, for me, I stick with that physical part. Like I abstinence, I have to, I
Yeah.
can't drink, and I
Yeah.
have to know that in my head,
Yeah.
that I can't.
Yep. And that truly is, I think, what people will relate to the most, because everybody feels. I mean, everybody has kind of different experiences from their drinking as far as what kind of trouble they get into and so forth. And people have different psychological problems and so forth, emotional problems, whatever, different backgrounds and everything. But the one common denominator is what alcohol does to us physically. That when I understood that, that was very comforting for me to know that. I mean, I guess I always deep down understood that, but when I really admitted it, was okay with it, I guess, or accepted it, and saw that other people had the same experience with alcohol, that did make a big difference for me, you
Yeah,
know.
and there's always certain key words or key phrases when somebody's sharing about their drinking that I can go, oh yeah, 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 yep, oh yeah, I relate to that, yep, and and the feelings too. I mean, definitely, but I just think we have to be careful. And I mean, this has been said, over and over. I've heard many people say this, but it getting into more how drinking affects us when we're sharing with new people, as opposed to, that guy was in jail, this guy did that, this guy did this. There has to be that, something to get to the meat of something, of how you're feeling. And that's why, again, going back to my very first home group, I just think that was, for me, again, it was my first meeting, and I think I'll always feel this way, is just keeping it very simple of, hey, this is what we used to be like, here's what happened, and here's what it's like now, and here's what we did.
So
And
when you guys did that at that meeting, did the rest of the group also share after the speaker, or was it just like the
yeah, so
person?
no, so what we would typically do, again, it was probably 25, 30 people back in the day. So it was kind of understood, and again, this is where I'd never been to a traditional meet or another type of meeting before, so I thought maybe this is how they all were. The understanding was that the sort of members of the group that had been maybe coming for a while, that maybe were doing some things or whatever, they would be the ones we would pick on to share for that meeting, 4 to 5. And then the new people, they would be there, and they would listen, and or whatever. And then maybe after a couple months, if they were coming regularly and we felt like, hey, not that we thought, oh, they're doing good, we should let them share, but more if they were, and if they wanted to, they would be comfortable. But the whole idea was, the meeting itself wasn't what was keeping them sober. It was the commitment. And the other thing that we did, it was almost like, and this, I look at it now, me looking back on it now, just committing to going to that meeting every week, in my mind, was my admission of being an alcoholic. It's like, I'm going to this meeting every week because I'm an alcoholic. And we actually even took it a step farther. We always met an hour before and had some camaraderie and stuff before, that was really good too. I enjoyed.
That was so important to me early on. And a little lesson that I learned from this pandemic was when you're talking about how those of us who've been sober for a while can sometimes forget about, what people are actually going through who are just getting sober. Man, I did not fully appreciate just how impactful this social isolation was to newcomers, to people who are like within their first year of sobriety. How really hard it was on them, and I don't know why I didn't get that, because when I think about it, man, I needed these meetings so bad, that first year or two especially, and I don't know how how I would have reacted, if I couldn't have had that meeting to go to. And, and I'd go to a couple meetings sometimes a day because, that was the only place I felt comfortable. So I'm sitting here with 30 some years of sobriety and I'm saying, oh yeah, this is not a big deal. I got Zoom, I got this and that. But God damn, it's hard on these people. It's so
Oh
tough.
man, and when I came back in after the 5 years, I remember sitting in some of those first few meetings and just sitting there thinking to myself, and I'd hear somebody share, when and there was this particular meeting that I went to in the beginning, it was like a clubhouse style meeting, and I'd always sort of been down on clubhouse meetings when I was, in the clubhouse, whatever. But this time, completely different viewpoint. I just went in there to listen, and I'd hear somebody that said they had 4 days and they were struggling, and that just hit home with me, because now I'm like, holy cow, like I get it now, and that relating thing like really helped me. And so again, going back to kind of that thought process of when you're new, when we kind of started the conversation of making somebody feel comfortable, I think that's so important, and I just, especially here where I live, I mean, I go to some meetings once in a while, and I just like, when something happens, I'm just like, God, I hope that guy comes back, or I hope that gal comes back, but you never know. I mean, maybe, I can't, I always try to remain open and try to think things happen and the way they go. I don't know everything. And, just my biggest thing today is to just try to remain teachable and open. That's what I try to do. I spent a lot of years not being open and teachable.
Yeah.
So, and in AA as well,
Well,
you
making
know.
people feel comfortable is probably the most important thing that I can do. I find myself now, not, I probably talk less in meetings now than I did when I was newer. And I think it's appropriate because I don't, it's been so long ago. And there's a lot of people in our in our group now who are within the first few years of their sobriety. And probably some of them weren't even born when I was drinking. And so I don't know. I just feel like I feel like it's really difficult for me to kind of reach back to decades ago to this experience and have it relatable to people now. So it's not like I'm totally quiet or anything, but I listen more. I'm trying to be supportive. Um, I will share some of my story when it's applicable, I guess. But for the most part, it almost feels silly for me to talk about something that happened 30 years ago.
Yeah, yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
definitely. And I don't think too, as far as like the sharing and meetings and stuff, it's like, I don't think, I mean, I like listening to a good entertaining speaker as much as the next one. I look at it more. I mean, sometimes I'll hear something somebody says and I'll think, oh yeah, but I heard a speaker say one time that nobody ever got sober on profundity. It's usually just, and like for me, I could say in the beginning, it was going to this meeting every week, getting hooked up with a couple of guys my age, and just realizing that I probably shouldn't drink anymore. I did the steps, I had a sponsor, I did that stuff, but it was more just that acceptance of a new behavior in a new way that I had to be,
Yeah,
you know.
that's what did
And
it for
I'm
me
such a
too. Meeting
yeah,
people
and I'm
like that. I went to my first meeting was a mixed group, and they were super nice. They were very laid back. It was like nobody gave me a hard time about God or the big book or anything. They said just don't drink, go to meetings, come back. They were so nice to me. But someone suggested I go to check out this other group, which was a men's group, and I thought that's kind of weird. But I went anyway. And what was good about it was that there were a lot of guys my age in their 20s. So after the meeting, we would run around together and do things. And it wasn't like we were just always talking about AA. We were just having fun. We were just having fun, enjoying being together and so forth. And so, but the meeting itself was really kind of rigid about the big book and all this kind of crap. But after the meeting, we just went out and had fun. And I think it was that experience of just hanging out with these guys and having fun and having people in my life that I could kind of relate to and have, that is really what made the difference for me. So the other group, everybody was much older than me. And and so it was good for me in that sense to be around people my age, and
Yeah, 100%. I think I heard somebody say one time is if you're new, get a buddy, a buddy, stay sober. I moved in with a guy right away, and we were great roommates, and he ended up being the best man at my wedding. And it was weird because, and so I guess it goes back to, it's the simple things, right? It's once I've made that decision that I can't drink anymore. Again, you can do the steps, you can pray, you can do all those types of things. They're good things. They're great tools. But when you just want to constantly just drive it in, like, this is the only way and this is the way it's got to be, I just think sometimes the traditional meetings sort of shoot themselves in the foot. I mean, that's I'm not against any of that stuff at all,
No.
but to remain open, I think, is the key.
Yeah. Gotta have a little bit of flexibility. Gotta kind of, especially I think, when it comes to people who are coming to AA for the first time and aren't familiar with all of the social aspects of AA, the jargon and everything like that, is to kind of appreciate where that person's coming from and at least speak their language, to make them feel comfortable and not do all the AA jargon on them right up front in the beginning.
Yeah, right.
But anyway,
right. I mean, just being nice, shaking a hand, whatever. How you doing? We're glad you're here.
Well, it's been nice talking to you. I'm so glad that we had this time together to share our stories with each other, and and to whoever might be listening to this podcast. Like I say, this is I feel really honored to be able to do this. It's been since 2015 that I've been podcasting, and prior to that, I never thought I would do something like this. And when we started AA Beyond Belief, I decided I would do a podcast to go along with it. And it's just turned out just to be the best experience of my life, and has really, talking to people like you and other people from around the world has really changed me. Every person I've talked to, they kind of their stories stick in my mind, in a way that I would never have experienced before.
Well, you get to come across all walks of life, and the thing I think is cool is like when we started the podcast and you were talking about that gentleman, I forgot his name.
John H.
Yeah. And the fact that you even say, I can disagree with him and you guys can have a. And the funny part was that when I was listening to the podcast, you guys would get along great. And that's so refreshing to see, especially in this day and age where you see what's going on in the world, that I can sit with someone like that. And that's really great. And just on a personal note, I love the podcast because I drive around all day. So it's like your podcast is in my rotation and I listen to it with a few different ones. And it's cool that you're able to do that. And you really do a great job of it. You have different people on and it's cool. So that's one of the main reasons I reached out to you. I'm like, God, the way when you talk and stuff, you sound a lot like how I think and the way I do.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. So I really enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thank you, Chad. I appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and play our outgoing music. And that's it. That's another episode of AA Beyond Belief. Thank you for listening. I haven't asked for money for a while, but I do want to remind you that if you would like to contribute to our website and podcast, you can do so. You can go to paypal.me/AA Beyond Belief or just to our website and click on the donate button. We also have a Patreon page that you can go to, patreon.com/AA Beyond Belief. We don't have a lot of patrons, but if you just give $1 or $2 a month, it really does help out. It adds up, so it helps out. So if you would like to do that, please do, but don't feel compelled. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you, Chad, for visiting and participating in the podcast. It was really great talking to you.
You too.